All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to Privacy in and Out of the Library, non-intimidating tools to keep personally identifying information secure. Oops, that's my page. So I'm Carolyn Bennett-Glauda, librarian for education and outreach at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. In a moment, I'm going to turn the webinar over to our presenter, TJ Lamana. TJ is a librarian from New Jersey, and the two of us met just over a year ago as members of the second cohort of the Library Freedom Institute, and we are both current members of Library Freedom Project. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. You are all entering the meeting muted, and later in the presentation, we'll be able to take questions via chat, and you'll be able to turn on your microphone as well if you'd like to ask a question out loud. At this time, if you wanted to take a moment to say hello, you can use the chat. Let us know where you work, where you are in the world. If you'd like to do that, I invite you to do that now. We also wanted to let you know that we're offering live captioning of this presentation. We're using Otter AI. So at the top of your screen, you can see a link to it. And if you click that, it will open a new screen on your browser, and you can place that window to the side of your Zoom window to see the captions in real time. So let this be a reminder to all of us and to me as you speak. Just try to talk slowly and clearly, and keep in mind that even with that step, computer-generated captions can be a little bit off sometimes. So if you have any trouble getting the captions to work, private message me, Carolyn, in chat, and I will help you out when I'm finished with this introduction. So as a reminder, what you type into the chat will not be recorded with the video, but the notes are public, and we'll save a copy of them locally after the event. So we trust that both in the chat and in spoken comments, you will be courteous to fellow attendees and remain in accordance with Southeastern's Code of Conduct. If anyone who uses chat in an abusive or threatening way will be removed from the webinar. So as a reminder, as you can see, we are recording this presentation, and we will make both the presentation and the slides available to you later. So as soon as they are available, we'll email them to you at the address that you used to register. In addition, we will have CE certificates available upon request. So keep an eye on the chat, and I will drop a link to the request form for the certificates, as well as the course evaluation at the end of this webinar. So with that, I want to thank you again for being here with us today, and for all the work that you are doing to keep libraries vital and relevant. We truly appreciate you. So TJ, it is all yours.
All right, let me share my screen and we can get started. Share. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is turn off my camera. I have terrible lighting here. So, we'll turn that off, hopefully save a little bandwidth. You don't need to look at my face. You'll be able to hear my voice and see my slides. So let me stop my camera and we'll get working on things. I need to do that, and I need to open up the chat. I will be doing my best to kind of watch the chat as I'm going. So if you have questions or comments as we're moving, that's great. We have an hour and a half, which is a long time for some webinars, and I want to make sure that, sorry, there's lots of pop-ups. I'm trying to manage everything. That we take our time, we go through things nice and slowly. There's plenty of time for feedback and questions, because while I may have a lot to share with you, it's really important that you get out of this session what you really need to implement these things and to get other ideas. So if as we're going along you have questions or something is unclear, you need more information on something, please ask them in the chat. I have built in a couple different breaks for questions. One thing that I do like to do, and we'll get to that in a slide or two, it won't take long, is actually take questions right in the beginning. This is a deep conversation that a lot of libraries have to have, and I'm going to try and keep it relatively simple and kind of broad. So we'll be able to cover quite a few different topics that you may want to discuss and review in your own library. And I will make it clear, I'll give my email in the end if you need additional support once this is all over. I'm more than welcome. You're more than welcome to reach out to me, and I'll do what I can to help. Fortunately, because of something like Library Freedom Project, we have a extensive group of people that we can tap for more information. So if I don't necessarily know the answer to something, get in contact with me and I'll be able to follow up with somebody who does and get you the answers that you need. So without further ado, let me advance my slide once. And the first thing we need to do is have a small discussion about why should we bother? You know, there are many reasons we should care about protecting our patrons' privacy. Some are obvious, some not so much. Think about why you're here and what you hope to learn. We'll begin by highlighting why privacy is important. So, you know, I'm not quite sure why everybody's here. Hopefully because you thought this would be an extremely fascinating topic to learn about. But I'm curious to see how people are going to try to implement this in their own buildings. Also, one thing, I am from the Northeast of the US, so I have the habit of talking quite quickly. I will do my best to acknowledge that and slow down. But if you notice that I'm talking too quickly, please say so in the chat, and I will work on slowing down and addressing it. I want to make sure that I'm clear, not only for everybody listening, but for the transcription, for anybody that may not be able to hear quite so well. So it's really important before we begin to understand why we should bother with this at all. A lot of people will see privacy as a hindrance to services. It limits what we can do and who we can do business with. So it's really important to understand why we're here. So this is why ALA matters, the American Library Association. I may have my own qualms with how they operate. But in 2019, I worked with a group to help amend the ALA Library Bill of Rights. We added Article 7, which included the right to privacy and confidentiality in library use. So it is something core to our profession. It always has been, but over the past 20 years, that has changed dramatically in the way that we view privacy. I will talk a bit about some case studies that have happened over the past couple of years. And the first one I'll talk about right now is the Connecticut Four, which were a group of 4 librarians in Connecticut who fought against a national security letter that would have shown user information to law enforcement under the Homeland Security Patriot Act. So it's important to understand that we have been fighting this fight for a long time. Unfortunately, not everybody in our profession is as dedicated to protecting privacy. And that's not nefarious. That's not a slight or an attack on anybody. This topic is difficult. This topic is complicated. So it's really important to figure out what we don't know about what's happening in our library. And we're going to talk about a variety of different topics that you can start working on immediately. So my next slide, is questions. I want to kind of get an idea as I open the chat real quick, what kind of things you're actually curious about. I have the many things that I want to talk about over the next hour and a half, but it's really important to me to be able to address what you're actually looking for. Again, why are you here? What kind of questions do you have? I want to take some in the very beginning if you have any. And if it's something I'm going to cover, I will let you know that we'll talk about it later. But if you have something now, let me know. If you have any comments, and again, I'd love to hear what brought you here today. If I know why you're here, I can tailor this discussion to hopefully answer a lot more questions that you have that I may not have known that you needed to know. So please feel free to use the chat at this point. You don't need to be shy. The chances are if you have a question to ask, somebody else in the group also has the same question. So again, don't be shy, no judgments here. There are no dumb questions. We're all here to learn. I'm here to learn too. I have found that one of the greatest things that you can do, and I learned this during my undergrad, was the best way to learn is to teach. So one thing I like to do is make sure that I am being educated by the audience, so I have a broader idea of what people are actually looking for. So we had a couple questions. Feel free to, in the chat box, make sure it says to everyone. You're free to message me privately, but I think that if you do have a question, ask it to everybody so everybody can see what the question is. I'll read the questions and go through what I can. So we had one question that says, privacy concerns minors and adults in the same family. I will talk later in the session about guarantors on cards and about how you should work with patrons on what information can and can't be shared. So that's definitely something that we're going to be discussing. The goal of this one is to talk about low or no text solutions to problems and privacy concerns that you may have in your library. So there was another question about PII in Easy Proxy Logs. PII stands for Personally Identifiable Information. And I don't have a good slide or anything about the Easy Proxy Logs right now. All I will say is if you have the ability to turn off logs, you should do so. You should never be monitoring patron usage of your Wi-Fi or public computers. So maybe reevaluate what logs are being kept, but it's definitely a concern. You don't need to keep that information at all. You don't need to save it. You don't need to monitor it. That is just one more vulnerability. And we'll talk a little bit about what those vulnerabilities are and why they should be avoided and what we can do to avoid them. We have another question, and I love these questions right up front. They kind of frame everything that we're going to talk about. So one question is how to give the best service without crossing a privacy line. So many times we try to help patrons with sensitive endeavors, but we quickly run into things we can't do. And that is a very important thing to acknowledge and admit. When it comes to privacy, there is a trade-off. That trade-off is between I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it, between ease of use and kind of these roadblocks that we have, these inconveniences. For instance, I'll give you a quick example. This is a little out of the scope of what you should be implementing in your libraries, but for my personal email address, I actually have everything encrypted, which means I need to send people a special key to open it. There's these few extra steps to set everything up. It's a little laborious to kind of make everything happen, but it adds an extra layer of security. So I find that the trade-off, and I only do this on emails that are sensitive, I find that there is a positive trade-off between encrypting my emails myself and the inconvenience of opening them, setting up, and reading them. So we had another question. Oh, there's great questions. This is exciting. Let me scroll up a little bit to get to this next one. I won't spend too much time on these questions because I do have a couple other question sections built in. But let me address this one. As you mentioned, patrons are much less concerned about privacy than we are, and are annoyed that we don't keep records of what they have checked out. Ways to explain and or work around this. We will talk about that a little bit, but to give you a brief kind of answer to that question is, yeah, we do them services they don't realize that we give them. We don't keep their reading logs, which is really important from a privacy standpoint. There are some libraries that turn their ILS on to allow patrons to make their own reading logs. It's not something that's done automatically by the ILS. You can create lists and things like that. For instance, at my library, we use Koha, and you have the ability to create your own lists. So one thing that we have to do is have privacy by default, but that doesn't mean that we can't accommodate what patrons actually want. If they are a consenting adult, if they are a person who can make their own decisions, they can make their own decisions if they want to record their reading habits. We should just make it clear what the ramifications are if they do. So hopefully that briefly answers that question. The next question I have is, given that each library operates fairly independently, even when we are part of a system, is there an actual mechanism that gathers data on the level of privacy protection each entity is actually practicing? Not suggesting a policing force, just whether anecdotal is being kept. So I'm not quite sure if this is going to be a good answer to your question, and hopefully you'll get more about this as we go on. But it's important to, with these logs and stuff, is to make sure that they're actually turned off. whether it's your ILS, whether it's Easy Proxy, whether it's any kind of anything like that. A lot of these things are actually on by default. We have been using Koha for a couple of years now, and it was actually a few months into it before I realized that the logs were actually kept. So I had to go in, delete the logs, turn the logs off. But it's important to know that no matter what ILS you're using, that these things may be on by default. And they're usually buried pretty deep. It's only usually system administrators that have access to these things. But it's still really important that if you get a warrant or an NSL, an NSL is a national security letter. It's kind of the same level as a warrant, but just for different agencies. It's important to know that that information can be turned over. So you need to be very careful about the information that you don't know you have. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. One last question, and then we'll dive into the presentation, is I sometimes see patrons doing things that are actually dangerous, like answering a phishing email. How far should I go towards telling them they are making a terrible mistake? That is a difficult question. You shouldn't be seeing what they're typing on their screens. And we'll talk about ways to get around or to mitigate those issues in a little bit. But this is a problem. One thing that you can do is hold classes in your libraries to educate them. You can encourage them to ask your librarians or library workers questions on these topics. So if they're getting emails that they don't quite understand, make sure that you have somebody available to help answer them. You should never be viewing their screen without their consent. So even if you're walking by and you glance and they're doing something that you think is dangerous, unfortunately, that's going to be something that they need to deal with unless they're willing to ask questions. I know this isn't the kind of service that we necessarily want to provide. We want to help every person with everything that we possibly can. It's why a lot of us got into this profession in the first place. You know, we're dedicated to serving our communities. We want to protect and empower our communities. But there are some lines that we can't cross. And monitoring patron behavior is certainly one of them. So the best thing you can do is make yourselves available to answer questions. And run classes that teach them. You can make handouts, although those aren't necessarily overly successful. Usually when there's a lot of things to read, people tend to ignore them. But having a sign near where your computers are about things to be on the lookout for, making tiny little handouts that they could take with them, and running classes are definitely some of the best ways to mitigate these issues. I wish I could say that we could jump in and solve every person's problem, but unfortunately, that's not something that we can do. So we've spent a little time answering questions. I have an idea and a feel of what people are looking for, which is exactly what I wanted. So I'm gonna dive into some of my slides. Again, feel free to ask questions in the chat. Feel free to, even if we don't answer the questions immediately, we'll try to get back to them as soon as we can. Again, if I'm talking too quickly, please let me know. But here we go, let's dive in a little bit. So the first thing to do is audit your privacy policies. Every library should have a privacy policy. This is a document that explains what information is kept, why it is kept, what is done with it, how it's protected, what it's utilized for, and things like that. So if you don't have a privacy policy, you should work on making one. If you do have a privacy policy, make sure that you are auditing it regularly. Technologies change quite quickly, so it's very important to make sure that you're up to date. I'm just moving this chat. I'm going to minimize my chat window so I won't be able to see them for a little while because it was blocking some of my screen. So what the privacy policy will do is help it will help focus and lay out the groundwork for what you actually need to do, for what you should actually be implementing. Every library, every institution is going to be different, and your needs are going to be different. But there are going to be some underlying factors that are extremely important that every library and institution should be able to follow. You know, you may, if you're at a university, you may have different laws that you have to follow than if you're at a special library or a public library or a private library. They all have different rules that you need to follow, but there are some basic things that you can certainly do quite easily. So again, if you don't have a privacy policy, you should work on creating one. And if you do have one, make sure it's up to date and that, most importantly, you're actually following it. because a policy doesn't mean anything if you're not following it. And this is one policy that you should absolutely pay attention to when you're making any sort of decisions within your library. So I hope that that's clear. Oh, one last thing is I will have my email on my last slide. So if you do not have a privacy policy or need help auditing your privacy policy, feel free to reach out to me and I'll do what I can to either give you examples, boilerplate ones that you can use, or if you need some help, I can read through what you have and offer some suggestions. One thing, privacy in libraries is like my go-to. It's what I care about. It's my focus. It's what I write about. It's what I present about. This is what I care about. And that care extends to every library worker, every library institution. I want to make sure that we're all in this together, that we realize there is solidarity between our working groups, and that we can all support each other. So if I can offer my hand on something as fundamental as a privacy policy, please let me know how I can help you. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about, and something that's quite easily and relatively cheap to implement, are privacy screens. These are pieces of a plastic-like material that you put over the monitor of a computer. And what this does is it obscures people from being able to see the screen if they're looking at it from an angle. So the only way to really be able to see what's going on the screen is to be able to sit right in front of it. This does a lot for public use computers that may be in a common room that people are walking by, that people are that people can kind of see. When you were talking about watching or seeing somebody responding to a phishing email, if you have privacy screens on, you won't be tempted to check out what they're doing. So I think it's really important to implement something like privacy screens. And these privacy screens shouldn't just be on patron computers, user computers. They should also be on staff computers. If you're working in a reference room or circulation, sometimes those computers can be seen by patrons, by users. So it's really important to make sure that they can't see it. Adjust your computer so patrons walking by can't see what's on your monitor. Chances are you may have patron information on there, and you definitely don't want people to be able to see that. People will complain that it's a little harder to see with a privacy screen, but that's a bit what I was talking about when I said the trade-off between privacy and convenience. If you want to keep this information safe and private, it's really, really important that you take these basic steps to protect your users. And again, that extends to staff computers as well. Any computer that can give out any kind of information, it should be very difficult for somebody to eavesdrop on that. Data collection. This runs a very, oops, I have some typos. I apologize. I guess my background color hid my autocorrect. So for those of you in the position to make or support policies, make sure you aren't collecting information that you don't need. There are horror stories about libraries that just suck up all this data that they don't need, and then there's a breach, and a lot of negative things can happen. For instance, another kind of case study is there was a library this past January that had a breach, and they had collected enough information on their patrons for whoever breached this to create fake bank accounts under their names. So keep in mind what information you are collecting, why you're collecting it, how long you're storing it for. So don't collect anything that you don't need, and don't keep, like, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. Don't keep information you don't need, and don't collect information that's not useful. A lot of us have gotten a lot better about creating library cards. Think about exactly what you need to actually create a card. You know, do you need their name? Probably. Their address? Maybe. Phone number? Possibly. Email address? All these basic things. Think about what you actually need to verify that they should have a library card at your institution, and disregard any information that doesn't help. You know, you definitely don't need something like a social security number or a driver's license. Anything that's really personally identifiable, you want to ignore. Chances are you really only need something like their name. And if they show you if you need their address to prove they're a member of your community, you can see that information without actually recording it, because you don't need their address for anything. You're not going to be sending them anything with information from your data, from your ILS. You're not going to be emailing them. You're not going to be contacting them. So all of those things, and when I say not contacting them, you may need their phone number and their email to let them know that a hold is ready, or they have an overdue book. But that information should be an opt-in. They should say, do you want to give your phone number? Do you want to give your email? Because ultimately, it's the patron's responsibility to keep track of the materials that they have. Letting them know that a hold is available, letting them know that a book is overdue is a courtesy, and it's definitely something we should be doing. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you should, remove something like that, remove that kind of service. But if a patron does not want to give their phone number or their email because they don't want to be notified about these things, I believe that should be their decision. They shouldn't have to give over any more information than is absolutely necessary. And then when it comes to discarding information, like I said a little bit earlier, the best thing you could do is not collect that information at all. Because once you do have that information, you need to follow your local data retention laws. And that may mean you have to store that information for 2 or 3 years. So if it's not information that you desperately need, don't keep it. Because then there's nothing to lose if there's a breach or if somebody comes and needs that information. Self-checkouts. Self-checkouts are extremely, extremely useful. It may seem like an overly simple thing. A lot of us already have self-checkout machines. And a lot of people are using them now during this pandemic because they don't necessarily want to interact with I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. They don't want to interact with staff members. Sorry, I got a little distracted by the chat. And I'll get to your questions in a second because I think they're very good ones. You want to make sure that they have these self-checkout machines, because many patrons may not want other people to know what their reading habits are. Obviously, this isn't usually a problem. People don't usually care if they're reading the latest James Patterson. And I will pick on James Patterson because he writes too many books, just too many, and they're too popular. But it's important to know that if they are checking out something on maybe mental illness or an eating disorder or divorce or something like that, they may not want other people to know that they're checking these books out. So having a self-checkout station makes it a lot easier for them to feel confident that they can check out whatever they need to. So let me digress for a second and answer these questions real quick. What about birthdays to distinguish people's names, say John Smith, or to see if someone is old enough for the teen computer? And then I'm going to read the second question as well. Asking for birthdays falls in this area too. Keeping that on file is definitely a risk when coupled with a name and address, even if you only want to know the age to determine if they are a child, youth, adult to issue a card. So yeah, birthdays are another great example. You can, if for instance, you need that information to create a card to see if they should get an adult or a teen card, you can check out that, you can have them show you their ID or something like that. Patrons are required a lot of staff assistance with checkout, so it's not entirely private. That's absolutely true. But when it comes to the birthday, maybe have their ID with their birthday on it or something like that. You can type it in, but you don't need to keep it. You can be like, all right, they were born in 86, they get an adult card. They were born in 2010, they get a minor's card, or however your library differentiates between age groups. But once you know what their age is, you don't need to keep that information. Now, there are some caveats. If they're minors, you need to know when they age into a new card. So that can be something that's a little bit tricky, and that may be information that you need to keep. So again, when I was saying you need to understand, what information you actually need versus what information you think you need. So you may actually need that birth date, and then you should collect it, but it should be kept as safe as possible. So patrons will require, so let me go back to the self-checkout. I apologize for bouncing around a little bit, There's some awesome questions in the chat. And what I might actually do is answer one or two more and then save the rest for our little break. So I hope that's okay with people. So we were talking about self-checkout, and we had a person in the chat say people often need a lot of help with self-checkout, so it isn't entirely private. That is absolutely true. It's unfortunate that some of these machines are a little complicated, or our patrons necessarily aren't used to using these kinds of technologies, so they may need a little bit of extra help and care when putting these things through. It's important to note that even if you know what a patron is reading, you should never, ever, ever discuss a patron's reading habit with somebody else, even if you just think what they checked out was funny or interesting, or you know this patron really well. None of those are excuses to share patron information. It's a big pet peeve of mine when people look at people's records to see what they're reading or something like that, or even more so judging what they're reading. I took a shot at James Patterson, but if that's what you like, that's what you like. I'm not going to judge you for it. I may wish that you expanded your horizons and read some other books, but if that's what you love, that's what you love, and you have every right to read what you love. So yes, self-checkouts are quite difficult. But it's still really important to have these offered, because chances are the people who really need these will they may be only a couple people in your institution, but those people should be afforded what they need to check out material safely. My next slide, user privacy via staff. I'm actually going to go back a slide because on this self-checkout, and I don't think I put it right after this, and I hope I don't have it later, I don't have my table of contents in front of me, so I might miss a slide if it's one or two out of order. I actually built a lot of this the slide deck from another project that I'm working on that I'll discuss a little bit later. But there's a specific order to the other project, so when it translated here, it may not be perfect. But the other thing is what I would call self-discovery. We have the OPAC, which is something that's really useful. And it's something that you should never be keeping logs on. But some people may want more specific topics, and they're not used to using our OPACs. So what a lot of libraries have done is made little handouts with sensitive topics on them that they leave throughout the stacks, or put on a table that's not near where people usually hang out. So somebody can grab one of these and say, oh, I need information on such and such a topic. I don't know where it is on the stacks. But if I have this little piece of paper that tells me it's in the 661s, I can go there. Or I can ask I can ask staff for cursory directions in that on how to find something like that. It's really, both the self-checkouts and the self-discovery are really important for empowering your users to use your resources to the best of their abilities. I hope that makes sense. What we really want is our patrons never to have to talk to us about what they're reading. If they don't want to. Obviously, if somebody wants to come up to the reference desk and gush about a book they just read, they have the ability to do that. They're able to make their own decisions about the reading habits that they have and about what they talk about. But for those who may be marginalized, for those who may be dealing with really difficult topics, we want to make sure that they know that they can go into the library, get the materials they need without any judgment, and maybe not even anybody knowing what they're actually looking at. Excuse me. User privacy via staff. This is professionalism in the field. I will sometimes rant against professionalism in the field. I usually don't have much to say about it other than I think it's a hindrance sometimes. We actually subscribe a lot of judgment when we claim about professionalism, the way people dress or look. Saying it's not professional enough. But when it comes to professionalism, that is about attending our core values. That is about making sure that we are following the ALA Bill of Rights, that we are following the policies of our library. That's what professionalism is really about. It's about showing our users how much we care about them. And that has nothing to do with a piercing, a tattoo, the color of somebody's hair or skin. That doesn't matter. What matters is we are offering the proper services to our patrons, and we are keeping them safe. We are keeping them informed. So I never, ever, ever want to hear anybody talk about a patron behind their back. It is extremely tempting to do so. There are patrons that we may not like. There are patrons that may have done something funny. There may have been patrons that did something else. It's important to respect their privacy and respect who they are as human beings. And again, I know it's tempting. I fall into this trap too, that if I have an interaction with a patron, I may want to share it with coworkers. And there are ways to kind of skirt around it using pseudonyms. Obviously, never using a real name is important. Keeping it as vague as possible. But we do, we're all working together. We want to make sure that that we are respecting each other and respecting our patrons. It goes both ways. If we want our users to respect us, we need to respect them. And that usually doesn't mean gossiping. As much as, that may be fun and it may be interesting, we want to make sure that we are showing them proper respect. User records, and this goes along with exactly what I was just talking about. You should never be looking at a patron's record without their explicit permission. There is a lot of information in patron records, what they have checked out, what they have overdue, what their address may be, their full name, their birth date, all of this information. I actually worked in a job, my previous job before I worked as a public librarian was actually as a law librarian. And one of the jobs that I could do to assist our attorneys was run background checks. So I had the ability to get very detailed information about people. The first thing they told me before they gave me any information about how to use this information was, if you use this information for anything but the intended purposes, you will immediately be fired and you could be brought up on charges. That's how serious they took this. And that's how serious we should take this. If we do not have somebody's explicit permission to view their record, we should not be accessing it. There really are no reasons for us to be looking up a patron's record unless they come up to and say, what do I have checked out? What do I have overdue? I have recently moved. Then you can pull up this patron's record and view it. But those reasons should be kept minimal. And again, if there's no explicit permission, please don't view their records. Again, I know that this is very tempting. You may want to kind of view what a problem patron may have checked out in anticipation or something like that. But again, it's really, really important to make sure that you are respecting people's privacy. Let me go to my next slide. Sharing records. Don't do this. Never share a record unless you have, again, a patron's explicit permission to do so. So without explicit permission, don't do it. Let me minimize this real quick. Not parents nor spouses, no guardians should have information to somebody else's record. So if a husband comes in and says, I need to know what my wife is reading, that's a no-go. If a parent comes up and tries to find out what their teen is reading, that's a no-go. Unless somebody is a guarantor on somebody's account, meaning they have explicit rights to see what is checked out and what is overdue and the information in that account, you should not be sharing it. This may aggravate people. They may be upset that they can't see what their spouse is reading, but we're there to protect everybody's privacy. And again, without the explicit permission of the record holder of that user, you shouldn't be sharing it. Again, this is a tricky one because people, again, get upset. And it's tricky now if you're doing curbside pickup on how you check who's picking up books and things like that. Excuse me. I'm gonna take a sip of water real quick. Yeah, unless there is an absolute reason to share a record, don't do it. This also, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is if a law enforcement officer comes in and needs information on a patron, they need a warrant. You should never be turning over patron records to anybody without the official documentation. So if somebody comes in and says, I need this patron's information immediately, ask for the warrant. If they need to come in with something like that. Don't let them push you around. Check your local laws to see what exactly they need. But under almost every circumstance, it's something like a warrant or an NSL. Again, an NSL is a national security letter that usually has a hush clause to it where you're not even allowed to talk about it. Another thing that you can do, and this actually just popped into my mind that I haven't actually talked about or put into either presentation that I've been working on, is something called a canary warning. Now, what a canary warning is, basically, it is a statement on your website or on your a physical piece of paper that says we have not been contacted from law enforcement about patron records or logs or something like that. And what happens is if you get an NSL or a warrant, there may be a gag order on it and you can't talk about it. But what you can do is take down that sign. So people will know that, something has happened. You won't be able to share explicitly what it was, but you can let them know that something happened and they can make steps to increase their privacy if they need to. So we're going to take a quick intermission. We are at the 45-minute mark, which is perfect. It's exactly where I wanted to be. So let's take a few minutes to recap and reflect on what we've discussed. We can take some questions. If you need to grab a drink, if you need to use the restroom, now is the time to do so. We'll probably take about 5 minutes or so during this intermission. But I will be actively answering questions during this time. So if you have some, please please let me know in the chat. Are any libraries receiving NSLs now? If they are, they can't talk about it. So we don't know. That's the big tricky thing, is if they are getting an NSL, you don't know, which is extremely frustrating and kind of scary at the same time. But I will say the answer is probably yes. The Connecticut 4 in 2003, I believe it was, had gotten an NSL. And they sued to be able to talk about it. They won, which was great. There's a lot of really good articles that I can send out about stuff like that. But the chances are, yeah, they are. They probably are getting them. And if they are, again, they're not allowed to talk about it. So we'll never know. Let me scroll up a little bit and see if I can check a couple of these chats that we got a little while ago. We got another one that says, yeah, we talked about, we had somebody talk about how somebody has an extremely common name, so they get a lot of contacts from people looking for other people with that name. So it's really important, again, and when it comes to people with the same names, and you're looking up their accounts, remember, they should have a unique ID for their library card. Again, this is a barrier, but if the patron themselves decides to opt to not give you that information, it is therefore their responsibility to have something that they could use to identify themselves, and that should be their library card. Let me grab the next one. Our library offers second phone call contact if an item is not picked up from the hold shelf. We do not give titles over the phone, and patrons get aggravated when we won't. Yep, that's bound to happen. But I commend you for not giving titles, just saying you have a book on the hold shelf, because you never know if you're actually talking to that patron or not. Now, if you call them and they're able to identify themselves with their library card or something, I don't think there's necessarily harm in letting them know what's on their account or maybe what's there to pick up. But again, I always err on the side of more privacy. So I am usually very reluctant to give out that kind of information. That doesn't mean my fellow staff members are as privacy minded as I am. And we'll talk a little bit about education a little while later. And yes, the the Canary Warren was the homepage for the LFP for years. That's absolutely true. Jessamine West was actually somebody who pioneered the Canary warnings for libraries as well. If you don't know her, follow her on Twitter or something like that. Jessamine has amazing resources, does amazingly good work. So I definitely think that's somebody worth following and keeping up to date with. Sorry, I had to turn off my air conditioner because it's quite loud. So it's getting kind of warm in here. So I'm taking kind of a couple breaks to grab water and stuff like that. But that's besides the point. You don't need to know. It's another reason my camera's off. Now, another example of why having a privacy policy is important, when you do, you can use it as a backup with an aggravated person. It gives you a valid reason to refuse a request without you having to take a defensive position. Absolutely. That is exactly why you should have a privacy policy. It's to guide the steps that you're taking to protect privacy and to back you up when people challenge you. You should be able to point to a policy and say, this is why we do this, and here's where we put it in our policy. Let's see. In a library I used to work at, families had linked accounts for minors. Guardians were always guarantors of their children, so they could always see what their children under a certain age were reading. Spouses could choose to link their cards so one person could pick up books for another. Yeah, again, that's all totally fine by me. When your child is too young, but you want to encourage them to have a library card, and they check out 50 children's books because one's never enough for the kids, you need to keep track of all the books. And if you're teaching them to use a library card, you want them to check it out on their own card. So you obviously need to be able to access their account to see what books you have, to make sure you return them all and things like that. The thing to keep in mind is the age that they opt out of, that they kind of opt out of this. What age do you allow them to get their own library card without a guarantor? You know, as children become tweens and teens, they start to discover who they are as human beings. And that sometimes run counters to what their family may desire, to put it kind of simply. So they may need to be grabbing books on topics their family doesn't want them to know, or doesn't want them to read, or the patron doesn't want their family to know about. And that should absolutely be respected. If a 14-year-old wants to check out a book about what it means to be gay, they should be able to do that without fear that their parents will know what they're reading. We need to protect all of our patrons' reading habits. So keep in mind what age you allow them to get their own card and remove that guarantor. And yeah, if spouses want to link their cards, more power to them. Whatever consenting adults want to do is okay. I mean, within reason. Whatever they want to do with their own information, we should allow them to do. We should just always let them know what that means. And we should allow them to go back on it. If somebody says, I no longer want my card linked to my spouse, it should be one person making that decision. If a wife comes in and says, I no longer want my husband to know what I'm reading, boom, unlink those cards. You don't need the husband's permission to do that. Let's see. I think it was Zachary, can you, what exactly is the FOIL request? Do you mean FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act? Because yeah, unfortunately, if you do get something like that, you're usually required by law to follow it. You can fight it and stuff like that, but for the most part, if you get a FOIA request, for instance, I submit FOIA requests all the time. I love getting information that people don't want me to have. It's such a joy in my life. Okay, excellent. We have Opera here in New Jersey, OPRA. So yeah, there's different names. I guess FOIA is usually for like something like Homeland Security or the CIA or these larger national federal organizations, and each state has their own way of requesting that kind of information. Oops. Right. For instance, and this isn't local, but I've submitted a couple FOIA requests about information that the ALA has, that the American Library Association has, because they've made some decisions I wasn't entirely stoked on over the past couple of years. So I've tried to request information from national organizations that they've worked with to be able to get this information. So it's really fascinating. It's a little out of the scope of what we're talking about because it's a little involved, but it's important to know that these things can come down to you. And what's really important about this is if you get a warrant, if you get an NSL, if you get a FOIA, FOIL, OPRA request, anything like that, you can't turn any information over that you don't have. So it's really important to keep that in mind. There's no information. If you don't have somebody's logs, you can't turn them over. And you reply, I cannot fulfill this request. We do not have the information that you've requested. Boom, done. Actually, the blog Boing Boing has a really good thing. They got I don't know if it was a FOIA request, but they got something where I think it might have been an NSL about logs that they were keeping on a particular router that they had. And basically they didn't turn the logs on. So they got this thing and they returned the letter saying, we don't keep logs on this. We have no information to turn over. So this is another reason why I think that keeping information that doesn't need to be kept is a bad idea. Because you may be stuck keeping it for longer than you want. It's information that may be used against your patrons. So it's really important to understand and keep in mind, again, data collection. I know that I've kind of gone on and on about data collection, but it's definitely it should be a main point in your privacy policy. Data is the main thing that libraries do. You know, from patron reading habits to weblogs to just watching what they're doing within the building. That's all data collection. That's all personally identifiable information. So you want to protect their privacy. You want to keep that information safe. Are there any other questions? Because if there's not, I'm actually going to take 1 minute to go fill up my water bottle because it's empty and I need a bit more. So percolate for a second, think about what we've already talked about and post any questions you may have in the chat. Once I come back, we'll get started on the final part of this presentation. I was worried I wouldn't have an hour and a half of information, but I think I have more than that. So we may hustle a little bit in the second half. So I'll be back in 1 moment. Okay, I'm back. That didn't nearly take as long as I thought it would. The cap on my water bottle is quite tight sometimes, so sometimes I have to fight with it, but popped right off. So let's move on to the next slide. Shred it. Get rid of it. If you don't need it, get rid of it. This is something that's really important for physical items. Dispense with unneeded information as soon as it's legally okay to do so. Follow your local record retention laws. Every state, every municipality may have different laws on how long you have to keep that information, but as soon as that day hits, as soon as you can, get rid of it. No matter what it is, if you don't need it, shred it, get rid of it. Give it to Iron Mountain to shred, whoever, buy a shredder, get something. And another thing that you should do when it comes to shredding is make sure that patrons have access to the shredder as well. They may have things that they no longer need that they want to dispose of, and the library should be a place where they can do so. Have a shredder for public use. I know there are like shred days or something in some communities where you can bring unwanted documents to like the municipal building or something and shred it, but they usually only do that maybe once or twice a year. So having somewhere in your community where they can dispose of information they no longer need is a boon to your community. It's definitely something that you want to offer. Password security. We're not going to talk about anything technical like a password manager like KeePass or LastPass. That's a little beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about, but it's about what you do with your passwords. A lot of people write them down on sticky notes and stick them in their computers. I hope you realize that as convenient as this is, it's kind of a bad idea. Especially if they're out on the floor. I actually had somebody at a library I worked at a while ago put a sticky note to our email right on the computer, which is in a public area. So anybody walking by could have seen this information, got on our website, gone to their email client, and opened up our email. I obviously gave them I don't want to say a stern talking to, but I gave them information that why this wasn't okay, why this wasn't properly secured. It's also important never to email passwords. I know that this is, again, very inconvenient, but if somebody does need a password for an account, you can write it down on a piece of paper and give it to them, as long as that piece of paper is kept somewhere secure, usually in a locked drawer, in a locked office, somewhere where you need permission to enter it, and only people who need something like that, who need that information, have access to it. So make sure that you're keeping all of those passwords safe. It's too easy to fall into traps where, we're logging into 1,000 different accounts with 1,000 different emails. So we want to make sure that we know what they are, so we keep them really handy. But if you don't remember the password to an account, don't do it in a public place. Don't write this down where somebody can see it. Basic password security it's called operational security, and it's what you can do to minimize threats. So I hope that makes sense and that's a little useful. This may not be in your privacy policy, but this is definitely best practice. Registering users for events. What information do you need, right? Think about that. Do they need to register with their real name? Is it for something like this where you're going to get a certificate, so you need to give your information to get that certificate or be checked up against a registration list? So I guess when I say riddle me this, and I doubt it, there are certain reasons. But for the most part, when we do our end of the year stats to give to the state or whoever requires that information, it's usually just a number. So take a head count. If you have a really popular event that people had to register for using their names, you may have a check-in list, but shred it when you're done. It's information you don't need to keep. And also make sure that you don't keep that list somewhere where patrons can see it. If you're checking people in, hold it on a clipboard in your hand and check people off. And the last thing I'll say on this is never, ever, ever have a sign-in sheet. Oh my God, I hate sign-in sheets. They are, they allow everybody to see everybody else that's coming into the event. They get their names. And that's just, that's just not something that needs to happen. You don't need a paper sheet of everybody that's joined a session. Sorry, they're doing yard work outside, so if you can hear that, I apologize. Yeah, you don't need to collect patron names. And if you need to check them off a list, make sure you shred that information when you're done. I've worked in libraries that had sign-in sheets for events, and I've had discussions about why that's not okay. And for the most part, they've acquiesced to me not doing that. We had a quick question that I'm more than happy to answer right now. We have a visitor sign-in book for people coming into the library for COVID suggestions for keeping track of people entering the building for traces. Let's see. Sign-in book for people coming into library for COVID suggestions for keeping track of people entering for tracers. I am personally against contact tracing in libraries. If you need to make sure people are safe to come into their buildings, maybe using something like a portable thermometer. But anything that logs who's coming into your building is a breach of their privacy. I definitely think that you should evaluate if you need to do that or not. and if you do, what information is kept, how long that information is kept for, and who has access to it. Remember, any information that you get may be subject to a warrant or something like that, so you may have to turn over patron information if you have it. So again, this is a service we want to offer, but it's not necessarily a service we should offer. We are obviously in extenuating circumstances right now, but this is where we need to really kind of put our foot down. This is when we get to make the policies that we get to follow in easier times. When we make the decisions during hard times, we're able to reinforce them forever. And we had another quick question. Do we have suggestions for an alternative to a paper sign-in sheet for community use at a private school library? That's a tricky one. You can have a sign-in sheet and just have them use their initials. But this may not be such an issue at something like a private school library. Usually, and private institutions have their own rules and guidelines they need to follow. So when it comes to an alternative, that's something that's probably best discussed internally. But if you have the language that you need about privacy, you can make a good case and come up with good suggestions. So unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer for an alternative. Using initials, using pseudonyms, using random unique IDs that they may get. Again, inconvenient for sure, but more private. We've talked about like colored cards, stamped time cards, and things like that. And unfortunately, my library is on the honor system. I don't know if that's unfortunate or fortunate, but it does require us to monitor how long people are in the building, which we don't like. We were hoping that we would get like tags or colors or name tags with times on them. So when it comes to how to know when somebody's session's time is up, that's a really difficult one. And given the circumstances that we're under right now, I tend to be more lenient. Like right now, my library only allows patrons in for 30 minutes at a time. And we're supposed to be extremely strict about this. I'm not saying I'm a pushover, but I want people to be able to use the library for what they need it for. So if somebody's on the computer doing something like filling out unemployment, trying to find a job, trying to find somewhere to live, I will almost always make an exception because that's the service I want them to know we provide. I want them to know that we care about their safety, which is why we have the 30-minute limit, but we also care about them as a human being and their needs. Contact tracing is just something that I can't get my head around right now. And I apologize if I don't have a great answer for your questions. It's just really tricky. It's a public safety thing. We want to make sure that we keep everybody safe, but we can't violate patron privacy. So we can't log who's actually coming into our building. So it's a very tricky thing that we kind of have to go on the honor system for, which is a very, very important thing that people need to keep in mind when they're coming up with their reopening plans. How do you keep your patrons and staff safe without invading their privacy? There is added risk coming to this. So sorry, I'm just reading the questions as I go. I'm actually gonna hold off on answering any more questions right now. We only have about 20 minutes left and I wanna plow through the rest of these slides. I'm always worried that I'm not gonna have enough to talk about and I always have way too much to talk about. And the main thing I'll say right now is I appreciate and I love that you're coming up with these fantastic questions. They mean a lot, they're very important, and they make me feel like I'm sharing information that you actually need. Minors and privacy, we already talked about, so I won't belabor this one. Other that children and teens deserve privacy as well. Make sure that people with a guarantor, that they can opt out of that at a certain age, and that you protect their privacy. Like we said, if they acquiesce and consent to sharing their information, totally cool. I'm fine with that. But it needs to be a consent. They need to consent to it. So that's what I have to say about privacy and minors. Vendor contracts, something that I will harangue people about constantly. I think it's extremely important to actually read them. That's it. Read them. Read the whole thing. If you're not, excuse me, if you're not able to actually read them, sorry if that's too loud. They're coming kind of closer and closer. Let me move real quick, see if I can find somewhere quieter. I think this is a little better. I might be a little more echoey. Can people still hear me okay? Okay, good. So vendor contracts, read them. Make sure that you pay attention to them. Once you get in the habit of actually reading them, you'll see in a lot of the ways they try to breach policies. For instance, we had a vendor not too long ago try to ask the library for a lot of patron information so they could do a mailing, like a physical mailing to these patrons, which is actually illegal. A lot of these vendors don't actually know the laws for all the states that they're working in, so they will try to skirt them out of ignorance. So it's really important for us to read these contracts, understand what they're asking for, what information they're gathering, how they're using it. And that may mean we don't get to use their service. But what's even better and more important about this is saying, we may say your privacy policy does not match the internal privacy policies of our library. We cannot use your product. Okay. All right. I got some. They moved, so I think it'll be a little quieter for right now. Hopefully I'm not any more staticky. Hopefully you can all hear me again. I apologize for that. But one thing that we can do, and one reason I like to do these presentations is because it brings us all together. One library who says, we're not going to use your product because it doesn't meet our privacy policies doesn't mean much to a vendor. They're going to make plenty of money elsewhere. But 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 libraries all say your privacy policy does not match our standards, they may actually have to reevaluate how they deal with your patrons' privacy, how they deal with your patrons' information. So it's really important to read them, to understand them. I'm more than happy to help you navigate that. I know other people and small businesses that actually do this for that's actually their business, is helping people with privacy policies and vendor contracts. So make sure that you're reading them, that you're understanding the ramifications. If you don't understand them or need help, contact me, contact somebody else. There are plenty of people out there that are more than happy to lend their time and effort to help you navigate these things. The Library Freedom Project actually has done some work on this as well. We have vendor checklists where we went through their privacy policies and kind of rated them on various topics. And I have a link for that resource page at the end. This, I believe, is actually my last slide, which is great because that gives us about 10 more minutes for questions while we wrap up. So privacy in the future. Privacy is an ongoing work. It's something that you need to do every day. New things are happening, whether it's on like Clearview AI, working with other organizations with facial recognition software, whether it's contact tracing issues. I was actually talking to a friend this morning. She went to a outdoor restaurant, and they had her scan a QR code to do contact tracing, and then she started to receive promotional emails, which is not why she signed up for that. So it's important that you pay attention to all of these kind of things, all the new technologies that are coming out. Breaking up a bit. I hope I'm better now. I actually went back to my original spot. So hopefully you can all hear me okay. So again, it's important to stay vigilant. And also, and most importantly, never, oh, hold on one second.
TJ,
no, I'm back in. I'm
breaking.
back in my original spot. I hope I'm not breaking up anymore.
Do you want to give it a little test? Maybe just a cord got loose.
I'm on my laptop and everything's plugged back in the way it was.
No, actually, now you sound good.
Oh, okay. I'm not going to touch anything else.
All right, carry on. It's great. You're doing great.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Lastly, the last thing I really want to leave you with right now is never be afraid to ask for help. We live in a complicated world, in a very complicated profession, but we're here because we believe in it. You wouldn't be at this session if you didn't care about this topic, if you didn't care about your patrons, if you didn't care about your community. So ask for help. There's no shame in it. I ask for help about things all the time. You know, privacy may be my focus, but I ask, you know, colleagues about privacy policies and privacy implementations constantly. And then there's a lot of other things about libraries that I don't have a great knowledge of. Like, if you sent me to tech services, I'd be lost. So I would need to ask for a lot of help. But one thing that I've learned is not to be afraid to ask for it. If you have a question, it's best to ask. The worst that you'll get is maybe somebody who doesn't necessarily want to answer it. But that's not usually the case in our field. One thing that I've noticed doing this for quite some time now is that there is a lot of love here. People love to support each other. We may bash libraries every once in a while for policies we don't like or decisions we may not care for, but it all comes from a place of love and care. It's something that we think is important. This isn't jobs for us. This is a career. This is what we're dedicating our lives to. This is what kind of gives us passion. For instance, I have my full-time public librarian job, but then I do things like this. I write essays, I'm working on a book, I work on field guides and grants and all these other projects. Libraries take up a lot of my life, but I wouldn't have it any other way. So I go to webinars as often as I can. I try to learn as much as I can. And I hope that you're able to take away some things from this today. We didn't go over anything too deep. I didn't want to give you anything that was difficult to implement. I just wanted to give you some ideas and some basics to kind of whet your appetite, to get you thinking about these things so you can ask questions, so you can learn more. So let me go to my next slide, which is what did we learn? So let's take a moment to think about what we covered today and what you can implement in your institution. So the way that I usually do this is by asking myself a couple questions. What can I accomplish this week? What can I accomplish this month? How about this year? And maybe most importantly, who do I need to get on board to make these things happen? Not everybody here may be a policymaker, but hopefully you have the ear of somebody who does. And if you don't, hopefully you'll have the courage to speak up when you need to. Hopefully you'll have some information from today that will help you do so. And if you need me to send you a sample privacy policy because you don't have one, or you don't think yours is good enough or up to date, I can help you supply that to bring that to the people who need it. And I'm not the only one who will. I'm not trying to put this all on me and give myself a ton of extra work, but I care and I want to help. That's why I wanted to do this webinar, so I could share some basic information with people who may need it. And I hope I hope I was able to accomplish that today. So what can you do this week? You can probably pick out a vendor contract or two and read over them. What can you do this month? Review and maybe rewrite your policy. What can you do this year? Maybe do an audit of your entire library and see what works and what doesn't. For instance, one of the things I did while preparing for this today was I took a day and I just walked around my library and I saw, you know, I liked this, I didn't like this, we were doing this, but not great. We weren't doing this at all. We were doing this fantastically. I'm not trying to put any institution down for not being perfect, because you never will be. But the goal is to get better every day, to improve a little bit. And it may take some time, but I want you to remember something that's really important, that slow progress is still progress. We have the penchant to get burnt out because we want to make big systemic changes very quickly. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. So it's really important to understand your own limitations, to practice self-care to make sure that you don't get burnt out. Because if you do get burnt out, you're hurting yourself and you may not be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So making sure that you're taking care of yourself, drink your water, get regular sleep, eat well, all those basic things you've been hearing all your life, they're extremely important. And they will help you do good work. The better you feel about yourself, the better you'll present yourself, the better you'll get information across, the better you'll retain information. So it's really important to kind of to keep that in mind and to not get entirely frustrated when things don't work out the way you want them to. For instance, I try to come up with cool projects all the time, and some of them get shot down. So what do? I take what I learned and I try a new implementation. I try a new angle. I try something different. And that usually, again, I may fail again. I may fail again and again and again and again. But I try to learn something every time I fail. And I try to put my best foot forward and not let past failures color my future. So I hope that you're encouraged to discover more about these topics. I have some resources, I think, on my next slide that I'll talk about really quickly about places that you can get way more information about these things. So here are just some resources that I used. A lot of them are ALA, some of them are books, some of them are other organizations. I have the Library Bill of Rights. I have Library Freedom Project, which has amazing resources. And I'm not just talking it up because I'm a part of it, although I'm also talking it up because I'm a part of it. And it's literally one of the things I am most proud of in my professional career. Amazing work, amazing people, and an amazing resource if you need help. The next one is the San Jose Public Library's privacy policy. I have a book from the ALA store about practical privacy guides, a Mother Jones article about the Connecticut Four, information about minors' privacy, privacy toolkits, privacy websites. The last one is another organization that I worked with called Tactical Technologies that has amazingly cool resources on privacy. I ran a project with them called the Glass Room Experience for libraries in the US. Massive success, awesome information about privacy. So one thing I didn't really cover, and then I'll kind of wrap up a little bit, is teaching classes and having displays. Do a book display on privacy, create a poster or two on privacy, work with organizations like Tactical Tech to bring in new privacy information. The Glass Room Experience was a cool art project that kind of showed where privacy intersects with your day-to-day life. So there were all these cool posters and projects to work on. We had a data detox kit that kind of showed you how to minimize your digital footprint and what you can do. I have tons more resources than this if you need them, if you want them. The next slide will have my contact information on it, so feel free to reach out to me at any time. I am on Twitter, but I'm a little more vocal on there, so I didn't want to put my Twitter link on here, but you can probably find me if you look for me. And here is my name and email address, so feel free to contact me at any time. I may not always get back to you immediately, but I'll do my best to get back as promptly as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, TJ. I'm going to break in for a second.
Yeah, breaking away.
To give you a chance to drink some water, and also second that it's really fun to follow TJ on Twitter, but it's different. I dropped some links in the chat. There's a link to the evaluation for today and a link to the CE certificate in case people need to run before we totally wrap up. And we will send you a link to the recording for this and the slides. So if you didn't catch all of those resources, don't worry, they'll be coming to you via email. And I have to second everything you said about Library Freedom Project. It's been such a joy to be part of that group. And there are, and somebody just said the CE certificate gives the wrong time, which is totally, I see that typo. Okay, don't request a certificate yet. I will fix that, and it'll be ready in just a minute. So All right, TJ, talk for a second. I'm going to fix the certificate and I'll be right back.
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk. Hold on one sec. I'm just replying to a chat question real quick. Yeah, Library Freedom Project is great. It's an IMLS funded program. So it's, it was a lot of work for Allison Macrina to put together. She's the director of the project. I probably should have name dropped her earlier. A very inspirational, powerful librarian who does amazing good work in this field. Library Freedom Project is her brainchild and her baby. So I talk it up whenever I can. We actually had a booth at ALA Annual in not DC, in somewhere.
In DC.
Was it DC?
Yeah, it was like about 3 or 4 years ago last year.
Yeah, right, exactly. I got it confused because I did another one in like Philadelphia where we had a different booth. But anyway,
Okay.
what was I gonna say? Yeah, and again, I'm more than happy to continue this conversation via email. I'm more than happy to set up other presentations with people if you want me to talk about these things elsewhere. I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to get the link to the slides, to the presentation. So feel free to watch it again. Email me with any questions that you may have. Cool. That's the majority of the information that I have. If there are any questions in the chat, I'm more than happy to answer them for the last couple minutes. I do hope that you got some good information out of this. I don't know how much might have been a recap for people, but even a recap is really useful if this isn't your primary focus. I'm an emerging technologies librarian. I think about this all the time. It's not necessarily part of my day job, but it's something I implement as often as I can. But it's what I do on the side. I have said this before, but I love libraries, which hopefully is obvious. But I have a lot of problems with libraries. And I think that we should acknowledge the problems that we have as institutions and work to fix them. And if I can work on the privacy part so somebody else can work on something else, I think that that's a great way to handle these situations. We have a lot of power in our profession. We have a lot of genius people doing amazing work in our profession. We need to acknowledge that and support that. We need a lot of solidarity between libraries. We need us all to work together for common goals. And we need to understand each other. So I hope that today's presentation was useful. Again, there's my email address. It's actually, I am a fan of classic rock. So just some background on this email address real quick, in case a little tip is the band Blue Oyster Cult. They actually had an author, John Shirley, write a book based on one of their songs. And the main character, his name was Ben Wacky. And his job was actually as a professional irritant. He would walk around parties and stuff and like whisper in people's ears and kind of start arguments and things like that to cause ruckuses. And I loved that concept. I love this character. I love Blue Oyster Cult. So I decided to adopt it as my email handle. That's how you can find me on Twitter as well. I'm a lot more ranty. I'm a lot more, I guess you could use the word unprofessional maybe. But it all, again, comes from a place of love and care. But don't be scared about my Twitter account. I try to keep it as anonymous as possible. Feel free to engage with me there as well if you don't want to do it through email. Feel free to shoot me a message. Are there any other questions? It's just about 2:30, and I want to let people kind of move on with their day. Again, contact me at any time. I will reply to you as quickly as possible, and I will follow up with whatever. And if I don't know the answer to your question, I'll do my best to follow up with somebody else as quickly as possible.
All right. Thanks, TJ. So I got the certificate working, dropping that link in again. Sorry about the confusion and my inability to type time correctly. TJ, thank you so much on behalf of Southeastern New York Library Resources Council and everyone who came in to visit us today virtually. Really appreciate the time that you put into this, and we look forward to undertaking this work. So Be well, everyone. Be safe. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.